The howling had become part of the walls. 3 years, and I no longer heard it the way a man hears a sound. It had worn itself into me the way cold wears into stone, not felt, simply present, the low register of every waking hour and most sleeping ones. My wolf, my other half, the great silver beast the packs of the northern reaches had called Varen for as long as my bloodline could remember, silver-backed, storm-eyed, ancient beyond any wolf the realm had seen in living memory. The bond between a king and his wolf is not a leash. It is a heartbeat. His joy is a warmth in my sternum. His grief is a weight across my shoulders. When he raged, I raged. When he mourned, I sat alone at the high table and could not speak. He had been mourning for 3 years. My first Luna, Tessely, my queen, my companion, had gone on a winter morning when the ice came early and the river bridge gave way. There had been nothing slow or merciful about it. She was there, and then the ice was, and then she was not. My wolf had not stopped grieving since. I do not say that with any poetic flourish. I say it as a man who stood in the yard at midnight and watched a creature made of silver fire and old magic throw himself against the stone ramparts of Vermont, until the guards wept and begged me to do something, anything. 3 beast masters in those 3 years. 2 healing women sent up by the council with resinous herbs and moon water and careful voices. A werewolf trainer out of the southern reaches, a man who had calmed battle-riven wolves for 40 years. He arrived with a chest of instruments and a confidence I had respected, and he left 10 days later without the chest and without the confidence, telling me quietly that Varen was not a wolf in distress but a wolf in mourning, and those were different problems entirely, and he did not know how to solve the second one. A scholar from the coastal pack sent a treatise, 26 pages, which I read in full and which said, in essence, that some griefs in moon-bonded wolves ran deeper than any known treatment, and that time was the only reliable answer, and that if the time stretched too long, the pack's safety had to be considered. My counsel had begun, gently and then with increasing urgency, to circle that last sentence. They were good men mostly. They said it with sorrow. They knew what it meant. A king and his wolf are one creature split into 2 shapes. You do not simply release your wolf the way you release a hawk. The bond runs to the root of things. The cost of severing it was not something I allowed myself to think about directly. I told them no. I told them again. And I sat in my council chamber on a morning in early autumn, 3 years to the week since Tessely had gone, listening to my first warden Roll lay out the petition from the Eastern Pack Lords, who now claimed that an uncontrolled spirit wolf of Varen's age and size posed a territorial threat to the grazing lands at the base of the Vermont. And I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that I had not already said, and the walls of the chamber still carried the sound of a grief I could not fix. And I was very tired. It was Roll himself who mentioned the songkeeper. He said it almost apologetically. He had placed it at the very end of the petition, as an afterthought, or perhaps as the only mercy he could think to offer after an hour of difficult proceedings. He said a woman had arrived at the eastern gate the previous evening, a traveler, he thought, passing through on her way north. The gate guard had described her as unremarkable, a pack woman of no great standing, no wolf that anyone had scented, carrying a travel pack on her back and a cloak the color of river mud. She had asked for one night's shelter in the outer courtyard, the way wanderers sometimes did in the old custom that my grandfather's reign had established, and that I had never seen fit to revoke. The gate guard had given her the guest corner of the outer yard, a fire, a pail of water, and thought nothing more of it. At some point in the night, she had begun to sing. Roll said it so plainly, the way a man reports weather. He said, at some point in the night she sang. And Varen had gone quiet. I was already on my feet before he finished the sentence. I had not moved that fast in 3 years. I think Roll was still speaking when I left the chamber. I did not stop to excuse myself, which was unlike me, but some things overturn even a king's manners, and this was one of them. I went down the inner stair and through the north passage and out into the cold of the outer courtyard, and I stopped at the colonnade because some instinct told me, very clearly, with a certainty I cannot explain and have never been able to explain since, not to walk into that space yet, not to speak yet, not until I understood what I was hearing. She was sitting on the stone bench beside the guest fire, which had burned low to coals. It was early morning, and the light had that thin, untested quality it gets in autumn before the sun fully commits to the day. Her cloak was wrapped around her, and she was entirely ordinary to look at, brown-haired, travel-worn, her boots showing the kind of wear that comes from long roads rather than carelessness. She was not performing. There was no audience, and she knew it. She was simply filling her own quiet the way some people fill silence with words, and this woman filled hers with sound. I have tried since to describe what she sounded like. I have failed every time, not because the voice was technically extraordinary, though it was, but because describing it technically is like describing grief by listing its symptoms. The range of it, the particular quality it had of reaching something you did not know needed reaching, that cannot be held in words. It moved through the cold air of the courtyard, and it found every surface, and it did not echo so much as it settle, the way the first snow settles, not falling exactly, but arriving. There was a weight to it that was not sadness, a depth that was not performance, the sound of something that had been carried a long time. Varen was lying at the far wall. He was awake. His storm-gray eyes were open and fixed on her. His head was between his great forepaws, the way a resting dog lies, which he had not been, not once in 3 years. Not in 3 years of sleepless nights and broken days and howling that had ground itself into the stones of my keep like a second foundation. His chest rose and fell in long, slow pulls. The tension that had lived in his massive body for 3 years, the bristle shoulder, the low perpetual snarl, the coiled quality of a thing always at the edge of breaking, was gone. Not suppressed. Gone. I stood at the colonnade for a very long time. I did not speak because I was afraid that if I moved, or she moved, or any part of this morning changed, Varen would come back to himself and the howling would begin again. But I was also standing very still because of what had happened to my own chest. There is a place beneath the breastbone, very deep, where the bond between a wolf-pack king and the world sits like a coal, banked and warm when all is well, smothered and cold when it is not. For 3 years that coal had been cold. I had gone through the motions of ruling, the councils, the petitions, the seasonal hunts, the necessary marriages of lesser sons and daughters, and I had managed it all with the part of me that knew how to move through the world without the deeper warmth. I had told myself this was strength. I had told myself that a king who had governed well, while numb, was a king who had done what was required. And now, standing at the colonnade with this woman's voice in the air, I felt the coals stir. Not blaze, not roar. Stir the way a banked fire stirs when a door opens somewhere in the house and a new current finds it. The slightest brightening, the suggestion of heat. I did not know what to make of it. I knew what the bond lore said. I had always known what the bond lore said. The first Luna had come to me the right way, through the formal moonlight, through the old recognition that every wolf-pack king accepts as the order of the world. I had not expected a second. I had told my council I would not seek one. The council had, with great tact, declined to push the point and had found other things to discuss. And standing in the colonnade of my own outer courtyard, watching my 3-year grieving wolf lie quiet as summer water, I thought, this is not a thing I am choosing. This is simply a thing that is. She stopped singing. She had heard something, perhaps the creak of the colonnade stone under my boot, or simply the change that a held breath makes in morning air. She turned and looked at me, and she was not afraid. That was the first thing I noticed about her, before anything else. No fear. Not the frozen polite look of a guest who has been caught doing something wrong and is calculating consequences. She simply looked at me with the direct, unhurried regard of a person who has lived long enough and moved wide enough to have lost the habit of pretending not to see. She had a still face, not expressionless, but rested, the way the faces of people are who have learned to keep their own company without loneliness. Your wolf was restless in the night, she said, as though we were continuing a conversation. I hope I did not disturb anyone. The courtesy of it, the easy, unassuming courtesy of it was so unexpected that for a moment I could not answer. I was the alpha king of Vermont. People did not speak to me first. Roll would have been appalled. No, I said, and then because that was insufficient. He has been restless for a long time. You appear to have helped. She glanced at Varen with the same calm regard she had given me. He had lifted his great head at my voice, and now he turned it toward her, and the look that passed between them, between a great ancient spirit wolf and a travel-worn woman who had spent the night singing to herself in a cold courtyard, was one of the stranger things I have seen in 37 years of life. He is grieving, she said. Yes. She stood up, straightening her cloak, not making anything of the moment. So was the song. That may be why he let it in. Varen rose, all of him, the full great height of him, silver-backed and storm-eyed, rising from the posture of peace. My instinct flinched. I had spent 3 years braced for him to rise suddenly, but there was nothing threatening in it. He walked to her, unhurried, across the length of the outer courtyard. She held still, not the braced stillness of controlled fear, the simply still quality of someone who has already decided that what is coming is all right. He lowered his head and pressed it against her shoulder. In 37 years, in 15 as king, in 3 years of watching Varen refuse every hand, every voice, every trained healer and beast master the world could produce, I had not seen him do that. Even with me, he had permitted closeness rather than sought it. In the early days of the grief, he had barely tolerated my hand on his flank. It had taken months before he would come to me at all. With her, he sought it. I thought, my wolf has chosen her. And the coal in my chest ignited. Her name was Saren. She told me over the meal I had the kitchen bring to the outer yard, because it seemed wrong to end the morning abruptly by escorting her to a formal chamber and speaking to her across a council table. She was a songkeeper, a term I had encountered in the old lore but not often in living practice. The great packs of the inner realm had their records, their seals, their moon rites. The songkeepers came from an older tradition, from the borderland settlements where the lore was carried in sound rather than ink. They preserved things in their voices, genealogies, old rites, accounts of pack bond breakings and reformations, the particular songs that had always gone with certain ceremonies. Saren had been learning and carrying songs since she was old enough to walk in the old custom, taught by her grandmother, who had it from her grandmother before her. She traveled as she was needed, a pack that had lost its moon song, a naming ceremony that needed its proper form, an elder who had forgotten the words that went with a particular rite and needed to be reminded. She went where the old ways called her, and when no one called, she walked the roads between callings. She had no pack of her own, no formal affiliation, no standing in the hierarchy, no wolf, or so she said, with a plainness that suggested she had explained it many times and had long since made her peace with what most people's faces did when she said it. A songkeeper without a pack was, in the eyes of most of the realm, nobody in particular. A useful resource occasionally, but not a person of standing. Not someone who warranted the inner hall's best guest chamber or the king's own time over a breakfast table in the outer yard. Roll found me there and spent several minutes looking at Varen's peaceful, sleeping mass with an expression I had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man trying to recalibrate a fundamental assumption about how the world works. Then he found the nearest thing to a polite phrasing he could manage for. Who exactly is this woman, and what is she doing eating with the king? I said she is a guest. Have the north chamber prepared. The north chamber. That is the guest chamber that. I know what it is. It was the best guest chamber in the keep, the one we reserved for high-visiting pack lords. Yes. He went. He was a good man, Roll, and whatever his private thoughts on the matter, he kept them private and did the thing I asked. Saren stayed 3 days. That was what she had asked for, not 3 days. She had asked for one night in the old custom, and I had asked whether she had a pressing obligation northward, and she had said no, not immediately, and I had said simply, stay. 3 days was not a formal visit. It was not a moonlight courtship. It was 3 days of a woman with a traveling pack sitting in my outer yard in the mornings with my wolf's great head in her lap, and then at my table in the evenings talking about pack lore and old songs and what the borderlands had been like that autumn, which passes had flooded, which settlements had rebuilt after the spring rains, which old families were keeping the lore traditions and which had let them go. It was entirely ordinary, and it was the most awake I had felt in 3 years. She was not playing at anything. That was the thing I kept returning to, those 3 days, because I had grown so accustomed to people playing at things in my presence. The council playing at frankness, the visiting pack lords playing at loyalty, even well-meaning people playing at ease when they were not easy, that a person who simply was what she was had an almost disorienting quality. She disagreed with me twice, clearly and without apology, on questions of old moonlight practice, once about the correct ordering of the springbond harmonics, and once about whether the Eastern Pack's formal moon rites had always been ceremonially distinct from the Northern ones, or whether the distinction was a relatively recent political invention. In both cases she was right, and in both cases she knew she was right, and she did not need me to confirm it. She told me, in passing, without any political edge, that the Eastern Pack Lord's complaint about Varen was probably a land grab dressed in safety language, and that the specific field boundaries they had cited in the petition were ones that had been informally disputed for 2 generations, and that someone had finally found a pretext to formalize. She said it the way she said everything, matter-of-factly, on the way to something else, as though it were simply a fact of the world that anyone who was paying attention would know. I had been paying attention. She was right. She asked Roll his name on the second morning, and then used it in conversation with him thereafter, which no visitor had done in my memory, because Roll was the first warden, and visitors tended to address him by his title rather than his name. I watched Roll's entire bearing shift subtly in response, not dramatically, but the way an iron bar shifts when it has been held too long in heat. He brought the morning meal to the outer yard himself on the 3rd day, which was not his office, and he did it with a manner that I recognized as a man who has decided, without announcement, that something is worth taking care of. And she sang every morning in the outer yard. Not always the same thing, and not always with Varen in mind. He was simply there, listening, choosing to be near, the way the healthiest creatures choose warmth when warmth is available and they are not afraid of it. She sang old bonding songs, the moonlight harmonics that the borderland packs had used for generations. She sang what sounded like a lament for someone long gone, her grandmother's song. She told me, when I asked, the one she used when a road had been long and the end of it was not yet visible. She sang something that was not a song exactly, but a pattern of sound she described as a lore holder, the way pack genealogies were carried before writing, the names and dates embedded in the intervals between notes, so that the ear learned them without effort, the way a child learns a language before learning that it is learning. Listening to her was not like being entertained. It was like standing near something that had been doing what it did for longer than any living person could account for. On the evening of the 3rd day, after dinner, when Roll had been tactful enough to find something that needed doing in another wing of the keep, I asked her where she was going. She told me, north eventually. There was a settlement at the edge of the high passes that had asked for a naming ceremony in the spring. Before that, she had no set destination. The road between obligations was always the part where she let the road decide, and the road had brought her here, and she had not had any particular urge to hurry onward. I said, there is old lore here that has not been held properly since my grandmother's time. We have records, some records, but not the songs, and a record without the song is like a map without the scale markings. You know what the shapes are, but not what they mean in practice. I paused. I was not, despite what my counsel believed, incapable of directness. I simply found that directness of a certain kind required more care than most people gave it. If you wish to winter here and work through our holdings with Roll's access to the record chamber, I would welcome it. The arrangement would be a formal one, a songkeeper's commission. It is an old position, and I would restore it properly, with full standing in the household. She looked at me for a moment. She had the same direct, unhurried regard as the first morning. She was not testing me or checking my face for what I really meant. She was simply thinking. "That is a generous offer," she said. "It is a genuine one. Those are not always the same thing." "No," I agreed. "In this case they are." She was quiet. Varen had padded into the hall at some point in the evening. He had begun to do that, these 3 days, come indoors without being asked, which he had not done since Tessely died. And now he lay along the hearthrug with his chin on his forepaws, watching both of us with his storm-gray eyes with the particular attention of a creature that has something at stake in the outcome. "I will think on it," she said. "Give me a night." I did. In the morning she said yes. Winter in Vermont is not gentle, and anyone who chooses to spend it in the northern keeps has either pressing business or a philosophical relationship with cold. Saren spent the first weeks after the first snowfall the way she spent everything, methodically, without fuss, without complaint, working her way through the old holdings in Roll's record chamber with the patience of someone who has learned that the best way to find what you are looking for in a disordered archive is to stop looking for anything in particular and simply read. The record chamber was 3 rooms, 2 of which had not been properly inventoried since before my father's reign. Roll had been apologetic about this. Saren had been delighted, which was not the reaction he had expected, and the 2 of them developed a working rhythm within the first week that I observed with something close to wonder. Roll's methodical cataloging mind, paired with Saren's instinct for what a document was actually saying versus what it appeared to say. The 2 of them communicating across the long table in the shorthand of people who have found an unexpected professional alignment. The first snow came 3 weeks after she said yes, the way it always comes at Vermont, not tentatively, not as a dusting and a warning, but all at once, fully committed, as though winter had been waiting just beyond the tree line and had chosen its moment. The pass road closed within 2 days, which was not unexpected. It meant that Saren would not be going anywhere until spring. Some part of me registered this with a relief I did not examine closely. Aldrich came to me in the second week. He was a careful man, Aldrich, careful with the way he raised things, and he sat down across from me in my study with the air of a man who has been composing a sentence for several days and has finally arrived at a version he can live with. He said that it was, of course, entirely appropriate for the king to offer a songkeeper's commission to someone of Saren's obvious abilities. He said that the record chamber work was clearly valuable. He said that the household had noted with general approval the improvement in Varen's condition, which had been a source of concern. He chose this word carefully for some time. He said there may be questions in the spring, when the lords attend. I said there are always questions in the spring. He said questions about her station, my lord, about the nature of the arrangement. I looked at him. He was a good political mind, Aldrich. He had managed 3 generations of pack lord politics, and he had, in all those years, never been wrong about the direction a wind was blowing before it arrived. He was not wrong now. I said, I will address the questions in the spring. He accepted this, because there was nothing else to accept, and he left, and I sat for a while in the study looking at the window and the white beyond it, and the thing below my breastbone was warm in a way that did not feel like a problem I needed to manage. It felt like something I needed to be honest about, which is a different kind of thing entirely, and one I had more practice with. What I noticed in those early weeks was small things. The way she moved through the keep, not as a guest who is careful not to presume, and not as someone who has claimed a territory, but as a person who is simply present where she is present, which is the quality of someone who has never needed to perform their belonging anywhere because they carry it with them. She knew the names of everyone in the household within the first 10 days, not as a studied courtesy, but because she asked and remembered, the way people do when they are genuinely interested rather than merely polite. She remembered the cook's preference for morning light when she was working through a new dish, and so she did not go to the kitchen before the cook had had her hour of it. She learned that the young stable hand had a particular skill with mending leather tack, and she brought him a piece of her own worn harness and asked for his help, which pleased him so much that for a week he could not speak of anything else. These things came back to me through Roll, who had taken to giving me small reports of them the way a person gives a friend news they think the friend will want. I had not asked him to. He had simply begun doing it, which told me something about where Roll had settled on the question. And I watched her with Varen. That was the thing I found myself returning to in those weeks when I had a quiet moment, which was not often, because a king in winter has the administrative backlog of a kingdom that has been deferring certain decisions until the pass was closed and things were quieter, and winter at Vermont is never actually quiet, but there were mornings. In the mornings she was in the outer yard and Varen was with her, and I watched from the colonnade the way I had watched on the first morning, with the particular attentiveness of a man who is looking at something he cannot quite believe is real, and is afraid that looking too directly will change it. He did not behave with her the way he behaved with me. With me, even now, there was a quality to him of managed grief. He was present, he was better, but the deep channels of loss that 3 years had worn into his nature were still there, and when he came to me, it was with the awareness of shared sorrow. With her, he was different. Not lighter, that is not the right word, more complete. As though something that had been missing in him was simply there when she was near, and the absence of strain that came from its presence was something he settled into, with the ease of a very old creature returning to its true posture after a long time of holding an unnatural one. She did not make a great deal of this. That was another thing I noticed. She did not treat Varen as an achievement or a proof. She treated him as she treated everyone in the household, as himself, someone with a nature and a history and preferences, someone worth paying attention to. She had learned in her weeks of record chamber work what the documents said about moon wolves, and she had begun to speak with the northern settlement elders through letters, asking about oral tradition that might not be in any written record, and assembling a fuller picture of what Varen was and what his particular kind of bond meant. She shared all of it with me, not because she was reporting to me, because it was interesting, and sharing interesting things was simply what she did when she found them. She found things. That was not a surprise to me. I had suspected the holdings were richer than our cataloging had made them appear, but the particular things she found were surprising in ways I had not anticipated. Songs for spring moonrights that predated my grandfather's reign by 3 generations, preserved in a notation system that was unfamiliar to Roll but immediately legible to Saren, who had been taught it as a child and had not seen it in a formal document in 20 years. A record of a pack bond ceremony that had last been performed in this keep when the world was younger and quieter, with full annotations of what each element meant and what consequences flowed from performing it correctly versus approximately. And in the 3rd week, in a folder that had been misfiled under the wrong notation system, and that had therefore been missed in every prior cataloging attempt, a set of documents about Varen. She brought them to me on an evening when the snow outside was doing what northern snow does in its 2nd month, which is to commit to a sustained and personal relationship with every surface it can reach. She set the folder on the table between us with the care of someone placing something breakable, and she told me what she had found. Not simply that Varen was old for a spirit wolf, though he was. Not simply that his bloodline was exceptional, though the documents confirmed it. What she told me was that the notation in the oldest of the documents, notation she recognized from her grandmother's teaching, notation she had not expected to see in a formal holding of a northern king, described Varen as a moon wolf, one of the elder bonded, a wolf whose bloodline ran all the way back to the first packing under the first full moon, when the bond between a pack king and his wolf was not a ceremony but a naming, and the wolf chose as freely as the king. She said, "A moon wolf in grief does not grieve the way an ordinary wolf grieves. An ordinary wolf mourns and with time recovers or does not recover. A moon wolf mourns in a specific way." She showed me the notation, her finger tracing the old marks, a way described in the lore as a calling. The moon wolf calls, in its grief, for the one who carries the responding note. Not the note of comfort, not the note of healing, not anything that can be learned or trained or brought in from the southern reaches. The note that answers a moon wolf's mourning song is carried by the one to whom the wolf's deeper bond belongs, the one who holds the other half of the moon wolf's bondroot. "His mate bond," I said. She looked up from the notation. The lore makes a distinction between the king's bonded and the wolf's bonded. In most cases, they are the same person. In cases where the king bond and the wolf bond are separate, she paused. It is rare. It is described in the oldest lore as an exceptional alignment. When a moon wolf finds the one who carries its responding note, the lore says the wolf will simply stop. The grief does not vanish. The grief becomes bearable, carried between two rather than held by one. The fire needed building. Neither of us moved to build it. "You didn't know this," I said, "when you sang to him." "No, I sang what I always sing when a night is long. I didn't know it was the answer to anything." She set the document down. "But I think the songs carry what they carry regardless of whether we know we are carrying them. That is rather the whole point of the lore-holding tradition. You carry what has been given to you, and you trust that it will be there when it is needed, even when you do not know it is needed." Something moved in me then, not the ember stir of the first morning, but something steadier and deeper. The recognition that moves not through the heart alone but through the whole chest, all the way down to the place where the bondroot sits. I said, "Tell me about the bond lore, all of it." She did. We sat at the table until the fire needed building twice, and I got up both times and built it, because it was something to do with my hands, while the world reconfigured itself around what she was telling me. She told me what she knew of moon wolves and their bonds, that the bonded of a moon wolf was not necessarily chosen at the formal moon rite, that the old lore had always described it differently, as a thing recognized rather than arranged, that the moon rite was a ceremony of alignment, correct and proper and important, but that a moon wolf operated from a prior law, that when the wolf had chosen, the choice was binding in a way that the moon rite only confirmed, never created. She told me about the responding song. She had known it since childhood. Her grandmother had taught it as part of the standard songkeeper's repertoire, because the grandmother had been taught it in the same way, and the transmission of lore does not always come with full explanations attached. Saren had sung the responding song perhaps 100 times in her life, at various points, for various reasons. She had never sung it to a moon wolf before. She had not known Varen was a moon wolf before she found the documents. I looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low. She had the same face she always had, direct, unhurried, entirely present. "And the person," I said carefully, "the one who carries the responding note, the one the moon wolf's bondroot recognizes. The old lore is not very precise on the person's experience of it," she said, with the slight dryness she used when she thought a question had an obvious answer she was choosing not to provide. "It is written largely from the wolf's perspective. Is it safe to assume the person knows?" She looked at me across the table. The lamplight was warm and she was very still, and Varen, who had been asleep by the fire, lifted his head and looked at me with an expression that I can only describe, even knowing how it sounds, as patient. "I think," she said very carefully, "that the person has known for some time." The thing about that moment, the thing I have come back to afterward in the way you come back to the place where something changed, was that it was not dramatic. There was no bolt of recognition, no sudden blaze of the mate mark, no ceremony. She told the truth quietly across a lamplit table in a winter keep with snow pressing against the shutters, and I received it the same way, and Varen put his head back down on his forepaws with the satisfaction of a creature whose work was done. I said, "Is it what you want, not what the lore prescribes, not what the bond moves you toward, what you, Saren, want?" She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking, the way she always thought, with the full weight of her attention. "I have been walking roads for a long time," she said. "I have carried other people's lore and other people's songs, and I have been glad to do it. I have found it meaningful, but I have sometimes thought that I would like to stop walking long enough to find out whether somewhere is mine. Whether something is mine." She met my eyes. "I think this might be somewhere. I think you might be something." The next morning she was in the record chamber before I was at my desk, which was her habitual hour, and she did not bring up the previous evening, and neither did I, and this was not avoidance. It was the way of people who have said what needed to be said and are allowing it to settle before the next thing is required. I had noticed this about her before. She never pushed what did not need pushing, and she never retreated from what had been said simply because saying it had made the air between two people change. She sat with the changed air with the same patience she sat with everything else. I found, in those days between the lamplit table and the council meeting, that I was moving differently through the keep. Not dramatically differently. I was still the king, still managing the winter's administrative weight, still sitting through the reports and the correspondence and the twice-weekly formal meetings. But the cold place that had been in me for 3 years was genuinely warm now, and warmth changes the quality of everything. The weight of a decision, the patience available for a difficult petitioner, the way a long meeting at the end of a long day sits on the shoulders. Roll noticed, in the way Roll noticed everything carefully, without comment, with the quiet readjustment of a man who has been accounting for a factor that is no longer there and must update his calculations. He came to me 3 days after the lamplit table and asked, with the directness I had always appreciated in him, whether he should begin preparing the formal documentation for a bonding declaration. I said yes. He asked whether I had spoken with her about the council's likely response. I said I intended to. He asked whether I wanted him present for that conversation. I said no, that some things were not council business until they were, and he agreed with the satisfied nod of a man who has confirmed that the situation is being handled in the right order. I spoke with Saren that same evening. I told her what Aldrich had said, and what the Eastern Pack Lords were likely to say, and what Roll had found in the primary bond lord documents. I told her all of it plainly, without managing her response. She was not a person who needed her responses managed, and attempting it would have been an insult to her intelligence and a kind of dishonesty about the real conditions we were both operating in. She listened with her full attention, the way she always listened, not performing concern, not calculating her reaction, simply receiving the information. When I finished, she said, "The Eastern Lord's objections are about land, and the land question has a legal answer. The Council's concern about my standing is about custom, and custom has a historical answer. These are not problems with the decision. They are problems with the announcement of the decision." Yes. And you have people who can manage the announcement. Roll has already started. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You told me all of this because you wanted me to know what was coming, not because you needed me to approve the path. I told you because it will affect you directly, and you should know what to expect. and because I do not make decisions that concern someone else's life without telling them the full shape of it. She looked at me for a moment with the direct regard that was simply her way of being in the world. That, she said, is a more uncommon quality than you may think. The council met 5 days later. I had not called a formal session. I had simply said there was a matter I wished to put before them, which was my customary phrasing for things I had already decided, but wished to afford them the dignity of hearing properly. They were 7, including Roll, and they arranged themselves around the council table with the collective expression of men who have been trying to work out the implications of something for several weeks and have not yet managed it. I told them I intended to name Saren as my bonded, not my Luna by arrangement, not my alliance queen, not a political match or a consolation appointment. My bonded, in the old terms, the Moon Wolf's recognition, and the formal ceremony would be held at the winter moonlight, when the pass cleared enough for the Eastern Pack Lords and the northern settlements to send their witnesses. The silence had a shape to it. Aldrich, who was my second warden and the political mind of the council, said, with the careful neutrality that meant he was choosing his words like footholds on ice, "My lord, the woman has no pack affiliation, no standing in the formal hierarchy. The Eastern Lords in particular will raise the question of precedent." "The Eastern Lords," I said, "have been making land claims dressed as territorial concerns for 2 years. Their opinion on my bonding will not carry the weight they imagine. Nevertheless, tradition requires. The tradition of the Moonwolf bond predates every tradition currently housed in that record chamber." Roll said it quietly from the end of the table. He had been in the record chamber himself since I had put the question to him the previous week. He was a thorough man. By several centuries, in the case of the Eastern Pact Agreements, the foundational document is explicit. When a Moon Wolf exercises its bond recognition, the question of formal pact standing is not merely secondary. Per the older law, it is not applicable. The Moonwolf's choice supersedes the formal hierarchy because it predates the formal hierarchy. He set a copy of the relevant document on the table. I have underlined the relevant passages. Aldrich looked at Roll. Roll looked back with the expression of a man who has read the primary source material and is prepared to cite it at length and at patience. The rest of the council said very little after that. 2 of them, I noticed, were looking at the door that connected the council chamber to the outer corridor, as though they were already hearing something I had been hearing for 3 weeks. The outer yard was quiet. The keep was quiet. 3 years of grief sound worn into the walls, and the walls had been releasing it day by day since the first morning Saren sang. The matter was settled in the chamber the way formal things are settled, with a recorded decision and Roll's seal on the documentation. But it had been settled in the way that real settlements happen, at the lamplit table in the winter hall. And again on the morning after, when I had walked to the record chamber and told Saren what I intended and asked her, once more, clearly and without any pressure of ceremony or bond feeling, whether she was willing. She had said with the plainness that was her whole manner, "I already told you I was. That has not changed overnight. I wanted to be certain you understood what it entailed. I have been a song keeper for 20 years. I understand entailments rather well." I had, unexpectedly, laughed. It was the first time in 3 years that laughter had come before the calculation of whether it was appropriate. It arrived before the thought, the way real things arrive, and she looked at me in the moment of it, and there was something in her face that I recognized as relief. Not the relief of a woman who has secured a position, but the deeper relief of a person who has seen that the one they are giving their trust to can still be surprised into joy. The winter moonlight was held on the last full moon before the high pass thawed, on a night that was cold with the specific clear cold of the northern keeps in deep winter. Still air, no wind, the kind of cold that makes every sound carry farther than it should and makes the stars look close enough to negotiate with. The keep had been preparing for 3 days. not in the extravagant way of alliance ceremonies, where the preparation is half performance and the performance is half politics, in the older way, which is more effortful and less visible. The pack fires needed specific wood, cut to the traditional dimensions. The ceremony circle stone needed the old cleaning, done with the particular solution whose recipe Saren had found in the record chamber, and that had not been used in my grandfather's time. The household learned, over those 3 days, the witnessing song. Saren taught it in pieces, to groups, in the evenings in the great hall, patiently and without ceremony about the teaching itself, so that by the night of the rite the household sang it not as something performed but as something known. I will not say the Eastern pack lords attended with grace. 2 of them came in the stiff-necked manner of men who had prepared formal objections, with their silver-furred counselors at their backs and their arguments already composed. They had not, I think, expected the record chamber evidence, which Roll had arranged in the most methodically devastating document I had seen him produce in 15 years of service. 16 pages of primary bond lore with the relevant passages underlined in red ink, and a timeline showing the chronological precedence of the Moonwolf tradition over every agreement they planned to cite. They had not expected the northern settlement elders, who had sent 3 of their own, weathered and quiet and long-memoried, who had heard of Saren through the Lorekeeper network, and who said simply that they recognized the Songkeeper tradition, and that the Moonwolf's choice was the oldest law any of them knew. And they had not, I think, expected Varen. The moon rite was held in the outer yard, as all the great ceremonies of Vermont had always been held, under the sky, in the light of the full moon, with the pack fires lit at each corner and the household arranged in the old witnessing circle. Saren came out in the dress that had been made for her, deep indigo, the old color of the Lorekeepers, properly made, nothing extravagant about it, but right in the way that things are right when they have been done correctly rather than impressively. She wore her hair as she always wore it, which was simply, and she had the same quality she always had of being exactly and only what she was, no amplification, no performance, no calculation of effect. She came out into the cold winter yard, and she looked like a woman who had walked a long road and had arrived. Varen was waiting at the center of the old stone ceremony circle. He had been there since before the sun went down. He had gone there on his own, without being led or called, and sat in the center of the circle as though he had always known this was where this particular night would resolve itself. When Saren came into the yard, he rose all of him, the full great height of him, silver-backed and storm-eyed, the moonlight catching his coat so that he seemed to carry light in his own fiber, and he walked toward her, unhurried, and stopped 2 paces from her, and then he did what I had watched him do on the first morning. He bowed. Not the posture of a resting animal. The deliberate, full lowering of that ancient head, the bow of a moon wolf in the old recognition, the posture described in the lore and that none of the living witnesses had ever seen with their own eyes, and that 2 of the Eastern Pack Lord's silver counselors went very still watching, because even men who have spent their lives in the formal hierarchy of pack politics know, in the part of themselves that predates the hierarchy, what they are seeing when they see it. The bow of an elder bond. The completion of a calling. One of the silver counselors, I was told later, wept. I stood with Saren in the center of the ceremony circle, under the full winter moon, with Varen at our sides and Roll reading the old words from the lore record and the pack fires warm at every corner. And I put my hand out, and she placed hers in it. The same unhurried, decided quality to the movement that was simply how she moved through the world, and that I had been watching for 4 months now with the awareness of a man who has been given back something he had stopped believing in. I said what I actually meant, which was not the formal claiming words. Those were right for some things, but not for this, and what I actually meant was, you came down a long road to a cold keep, and you brought something back that I had lost. I would like to spend the rest of my life being equal to that. She looked at me, steady and unhurried, with that direct regard that had been the first thing I noticed about her in the colonnade light of an autumn morning, when she was a stranger, and I was a man who had forgotten what the coal in his chest felt like when it was warm. That, she said, is a good place to begin. The objections, I was told, did not survive the carriage ride home. The things that changed were not always the ones I had expected. The most surprising change was in me. I had governed Vermont for 15 years, and I had governed it competently, and I had always known that something in the governing was missing the quality it would have had if the cold place below my breastbone had not been cold. I had not known how much of the weight of rule I had been carrying with that coldness until it was warm again and the weight redistributed itself. Not lessened. The obligations of a king do not lessen with happiness, they merely become more possible, but the quality of the decisions was different. The patience for a long council meeting was different. The capacity to sit with a difficult problem until it resolved itself, rather than forcing a resolution before it was ready, was different. Roll told me at some point in the second year that the household had noticed. He said it plainly, with the satisfaction of a man reporting a good outcome. The household had noticed that the king was himself again, and that this was a source of relief to people who had been working for 3 years in a place where the king was managing, which is a different and harder thing to work alongside. I thanked him. He said it was not thanks he was looking for. He said it as information because it was true and because he thought I should know it. Varen did not stop grieving entirely. The old lore was right about that. The grief became bearable, carried differently, distributed between two instead of held by one. On full moons, when the weight of the world bent toward the older things, he would still call out in the night, and Saren would sit at the open window of the high chamber and answer him, as naturally as breathing, the old responding song moving through the cold air and finding him wherever he was in the outer yard, and the calling would gentle into quiet and stay quiet. It was not a performance. It was simply what their bond was, a conversation carried in sound, the way all the oldest bonds in the lore were carried. I would lie awake and listen to the two of them and feel, in the place below the breastbone, the warmth that is not blazing but is constant, which is the better kind. The Eastern Pack Lords renegotiated the land claims. Roll handled most of it, with the 16-page primary document and a patience and a method I had always admired, and the resolution that emerged from 3 rounds of formal correspondence was fairer than the original petition had been by a margin that satisfied even Aldrich, who tended to view any resolution he had not anticipated with a degree of suspicion before accepting it. The record chamber work continued through the spring and into the summer. Saren found 4 more notation systems, 2 of which she could read, and 2 of which became a project she shared with a young scholar from the coastal packs whom Roll located, and who arrived in early summer with the enthusiasm of someone who has been told there is a problem they might be able to solve, and finds the problem is even richer than described. The 3 of them, Roll, Saren, the young scholar Avon, worked through the archive with a systematic thoroughness that transformed 3 rooms of partially inventoried lore into something legible, living, and usable. Avon stayed. He had come for a season and the material was too good to leave, and by the time he said this aloud, we had all already assumed it. She taught the household the Moonrite harmonics, not as a ceremonial performance but as a living practice. The way she had learned it passed from person to person, casually, in the course of daily life, the way the real knowledge has always traveled. A kitchen girl who had known a fragment of the seed song from her grandmother learned the full form. A guard at the night post who had carried a piece of the shift song his whole life and had thought it a private family relic discovered, with a visible relief, that it was part of something much larger that had simply been interrupted. By the following winter, the keep itself sounded different. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet change of a place where the old forms are being practiced again, which is a different quality of silence than a place where they have been forgotten. She was still always exactly what she was. That did not change with the change in her standing. The packwomen of the formal hierarchy, who had expected something from the new bonded, a performance of the role, a careful navigation of precedents, encountered instead a woman who was interested in their lore holdings and their grandmother's song memories, and who had the unassuming quality of someone who has never understood why people withhold things, and who therefore received what they had to give without making it feel like a gift, which turned out to be exactly the right quality to have. I watched all of this the way a king who has been given back something he had stopped believing in watches, carefully, quietly, with the awareness that the right response to grace is not to make much of it, but to be worthy of it. On a morning in the second autumn, I was in the outer yard when Saren came out from the record chamber with a scroll she had found in the back stacks. It had been misfiled under the wrong notation system and missed in every prior cataloging attempt, and it turned out, when she had worked through it, to be an account of a moon wolf bonding ceremony from 4 generations back, with the full original song transcribed in a notation she had by then mastered. She sat down on the stone bench where I had first seen her, in the early light of an autumn morning that had the same thin, untested quality as that first morning, and she read through the scroll in the quiet way she did everything. And Varen, who had been lying along the wall the way he liked to lie in the mornings now, in the easy posture of a creature no longer coiled, stood up and walked over and sat beside her with his great silver shoulder against her knee. And she put her hand on his head without looking up from the scroll, and he closed his eyes. I stood at the colonnade. The coal had not gone cold again. In 37 years and 15 as king, and 3 years of grief, and 2 years of this, 2 years of a woman who was exactly what she was, carrying what she carried, asking nothing of the world that she was not prepared to give, that was the one thing I could say with the full weight of certainty. It had not gone cold again. It was not the blazing recognition of the first morning, nor the steadying warmth of the lamplit table, nor the moon-bright clarity of the ceremony night. It was simply the warmth that is there when you wake in the morning in a place that is yours, that has been built and tended and is real, and that will still be there when the day asks something of you and you turn back to it. She looked up from the scroll. She saw me at the colonnade. She said nothing, but there was a quality in the look that had always been its own kind of conversation, the directness, the unperformed regard, the acknowledgement of something they do not need and have never needed a name for, because some things are the name for themselves. I walked across the courtyard and sat beside her on the stone bench, and Varen shifted his silver weight to accommodate the new arrangement, and settled again with the unself-conscious satisfaction of an old moon wolf who has been waiting a long time for an arrangement this particular. The autumn light came into the yard thin and clear, and Saren showed me the old notation in the scroll, her finger tracing the marks, and told me what they meant and where they came from and what had almost been lost, and what, by whatever grace governs these things, had not been lost after all. That was the shape of it, not the single moment I would point to and say, there, that was when, but the thing I would carry when I was old and was asked what it had been to find her and to be found. The road to her had been long, as all the real roads are. She had walked it on her own feet, carrying what had been given her to carry, and arrived on an autumn morning at a cold gate in a keep that did not know it was waiting, and I had stood still long enough for her to arrive. And the wolf who had grieved for 3 years lay between us in the autumn sun, and was at peace.